Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zachary Kipping. Like Kyle said, I am a software developer and Angular Bootcamp instructor with Oasis Digital. And for this Angular lunch today, we're going to be talking about the one simple trick to ngIf your root component. Or in less clickbaity terms, we're going to be talking about more or less how to take manual hold of how Angular does its bootstrapping process to kind of dynamically decide what you want your root component to be in your application based on like some business logic, runtime data, all that good stuff. So as we start off, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a high overview of how bootstrapping more or less works in Angular, not diving into the deep under the hood stuff, but just a simplistic approach to it so everyone's kind of on the same page. And then we'll delve into a little bit of the more complicated stuff, the simple trick I'm referencing here, and then eventually pop into a problem domain and stack blitz that we're trying to solve. Right, so without further ado, what is bootstrapping in Angular? And for starters, it has absolutely nothing to do with Bootstrap, the CSS library. The only actual correlation there is the word bootstrap. And all jokes aside, bootstrapping is an important word in software development. It basically just means a mechanism by which you can pass an input and get some setup, finished out product or application that is fully set up based on your inputs. So in our case with Angular, the bootstrapping is us giving it some input and it going through the process of setting up your application and creating all the rendering and setup code that needs to happen in index.html and all that stuff where all the magic kind of occurs. So there's 4 core bits to how bootstrapping more or less works in Angular, just from a high level again. And the first bit here is starting in the main.ts file. So for those of you that don't know, the main.ts file is more or less the starting point for Angular's code and just the general JavaScript code of your application. So the main.ts gets loaded up into index.html with a script tag, and then this chunk on screen right now gets run. It's a very small snippet. It's completely auto-generated, so most people completely overlook it, but it's relatively important to how bootstrapping works with Angular. If you haven't noticed by now, there's a giant rectangle around the word bootstrap module, and this function is actually kicking off the first bootstrapping processes that Angular needs to do to set up your application. And this is also the first area where you can give Angular an input. So I mentioned earlier, bootstrapping is a process in which you give an input and get a result. Here, we're giving an input of a root module, a root ng module that we can hand Angular, and it starts kicking things off. Now, the setup work you need to do inside your app module in order for Angular to actually work and finish off its bootstrapping process comes in the form of the bootstrap property in the ng module's configuration object. So the bootstrap property here, you can hand it a couple or more, or one or more, sorry, components inside that array. And Angular basically just uses this kind of similar to how the declarations property works. It just uses these components as a baseline for what it can render inside the index.html, as opposed to the declarations, which uses those components as a baseline for what it can render in other components templates. So they're kind of the same, but they just have different scopes of access. One's index.html, one's other templates inside components. So when this app module gets bootstrapped, Angular looks at this bootstrap property, finds the components it can use for rendering, and the most important part is looking at the selector inside the component. So whenever Angular wants to render out a component, it tries to look at the selector and tries to find a matching element somewhere in some HTML. So in our case, we can take this app-root selector and look inside our index.html. This is just going to be a small snippet of what index.html looks on a typical generated Angular application. So here you can see in the giant obnoxious yellow rectangle, we have a app-root elements there. So Angular finds that, says, okay, cool, I know what an app-root is based on the selector we saw, and it's going to boot up an app component for rendering. And that's where everything kind of just kicks off. Angular does all of its magic with change detection and rendering, and your entire component hierarchy just starts rendering, and all your custom code starts executing. So at that point, we kind of got through the entire setup process. It's not that much. There's a lot of magic that kind of happens under the hood. But as a high overview, it's enough for us to understand what's kind of going on with the bootstrapping process, from all the way from the main.ts here in the bottom left corner, giving Angular a root module input, all the way to Angular looking for a certain element in the index.html for a root component and actually starting the rendering process and the change detection cycles. All right, so at that point, high overview done. I'm gonna go ahead and shelve this to the side, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. I wanna start talking though about the inspiration for this talk. So I was on a client project and I came up with a need to essentially swap out the root component based on environment and runtime data. Now the root component is inside the index.html. So this kind of poses a bit of a problem. That's not really inside an Angular template. It's not inside the Angular context. What do I do? The runtime data was more or less coming from the Angular context as well. So there's kind of a interesting position to be in when you need to do this. From my side, just because of my own, expertise, I wanted something that was an Angular specific solution. I didn't really want to hack something together with JavaScript or TypeScript, just pure whatever, or anything really on the back end to solve this problem, because I wanted it to be in my domain of knowledge, and I wanted to have responsibility for this. Along with this, I also just wanted it to be very testable. So unit testing and E2E testing, I want it to be very, very testable, just so I can do my due diligence as a software developer. And along with this, I also just wanted a reusable strategy. So the reusable strategy kind of comes into play because my client project was using NX. If you ever never heard of NX, it's basically just kind of like a monorepo style system for Angular projects. So the crux of that is we had a ton of projects or applications on our monorepo that were using a bunch of generic libs or whatever if you use NX. So I needed something that was very reusable, something that could be borderline generated in a schematic and just kind of left alone and thrown to the wayside. So the normal run-of-the-mill developers didn't have to worry about any of that code or even see it really in their day-to-day lives. So in this case, I pretty quickly came up with a few solutions that might work, right? Most software developers can think of maybe something they could do, like one or two ideas off the top of their head that might work, might not work, but it's good to try them out and test them, think through them logically. So my first idea was, hey, I kind of understand how the baseline bootstrapping process works. Maybe I can use the main.ts in some way to swap out the root module and pretty much hand Angular an entirely different application. In a lot of cases, this solution would probably work. It's not that terrible of a solution. It's just handing Angular a completely different root module, whole bunch of different setup code and everything like that. It would work more than likely. Only issue with this, well, actually there's a few issues with this I encountered was, again, having to have an entire separate module that's set up in the exact same way. There's a lot of boilerplate code that's repeated. And we're inside the main.ts. So it doesn't really fit the bill for being an Angular specific solution necessarily, because I don't have the Angular context inside the main.ts that I would expect. The main.ts is pretty much pure JavaScript / TypeScript. So anything I do inside there, I'm not going to have access to like my services and dependency injection and all this stuff. It's rather hard-ish to test if you're trying to mock things out. So in this case, I kind of put this to the wayside. If worst case scenario, I had to use this system, I would, but I wanted to try and find something better. Now, another idea that came to mind was modifying the host server. Now, I more or less rejected this right away, but it does have some merits. Modifying the host server possibly to evaluate some business logic / environment data to kind of see like, hey, if I get under this circumstance, let's maybe host this application versus another application. A few problems with that is having to have multiple built applications for every single like project / product that is being produced in your monorepo, which really kind of sucks. And then also just general, like I have a Node.js server that was pretty generic in my client project. Didn't really want to modify it too much. It was being used for hundreds of applications. Didn't really want to have to impact those. So I just kind of instantly rejected this idea, but it could work in a more general, easy use case outside a monorepo system. Eventually, I did a little bit more research, did a little more tinkering, and I fell across this ngDoBootstrap function. Now, if you haven't heard of this, it's essentially an interface that can be implemented on your root module that gives you a manual hook into how the bootstrapping process works in the root module. So looking at how an actual implementation of this might look like, we can see that the doBootstrap interface is being applied to the root module, this app module. And then we get this hook, the ngDoBootstrap function. So this hook basically allows us to run some business code, business logic, run some manual code while the app module, while the application is still deciding what components can actually be bootstrapped and used inside the index.html. Nothing in the application runs until you actually call this appref.bootstrap and hand it at least one component. All right, so again, just doing that application ref, getting that bootstrap, handing it the component, kicks off all the stuff, is basically a one-to-one on how the bootstrap property works in the ng module decorator object that we saw earlier. You would only do one or the other, so if you did the bootstrap property, you wouldn't really need to do this, and if you do it this way, you don't need to do the bootstrap property. They're basically replacements for each other. Now, realistically, you probably wouldn't do this if you just had this amount of code. You need to add some business logic to it to actually make this worthwhile. So on top of that, we're going to go ahead and just kind of hop into the workshop. Again, short bit of a talk. So we're going to spend a little bit longer in the workshop here, just kind of looking through some of the business logic and how things would look in a more real project. And along with that, StackBlitz also has kind of a fun problem domain I came up with that's kind of integral to how it works inside the browser. So if you've never used StackBlitz before, it's basically a VS Code editor inside your Chrome browser, which is pretty cool. You can make and kind of prototype a lot of different applications really fast without having to boot up everything inside your computer, take up memory space, yada yada. So a fun little bit of functionality and tidbit to know about StackBlitz is that this rendering over here on the right-hand side is essentially an iframe. Sorry, almost back there. This rendering on the right-hand side is an iframe. But if I were to open this application, this running application in a new window, it's not in an iframe. So we have some fun bit of business logic there of, hey, maybe I can swap out the root component based on whether the application is inside a iframe or not. So this is kind of the problem domain I created with StackBlitz just because it's kind of fun, uses some of the core functionality of how StackBlitz works. So we're going to see how that business logic works, how I approached it from a realistic application perspective inside the code base itself. So I'm going to go ahead and start in the main.ts here, where we pretty much have the same exact code we saw earlier when I was giving that high level overview of how bootstrapping worked. So here on line 7, you can see that we just, have that setup work that Angular creates its platform. And then we call that bootstrap module function I mentioned earlier that does the bootstrapping process for a root module. And this is the first input you actually really give to the Angular system for your custom code. So in that case, pretty much all the magic of our business logic is happening inside the app module. So if we were to hop over to that, we can start seeing a decent amount of code added to base compared to like the base app module I had inside my presentation. So for now, I'm going to focus mostly on the ngDoBootstrap, and we'll come back to some of the other code up top, this kind of configuration setup code that was more, that was more indicative of a actual real project. So in this case, the ngDoBootstrap, we get that application reference to the bootstrap process, and we create this root component constant that is being decided upon by this pure function over here. So this decide root component basically houses all my business logic for how I'm deciding the root component for the application. It takes a window argument and it takes an environment argument. And then eventually I just bootstrap that component and Angular kicks off. Does all the rendering, does all the change detection cycles and all that fun stuff. Basically the magic of how Angular really works. So a few questions here you might be posing. All right. Why does window have a this on it? And if you ever use the environment, why is that also having a this in front of it as well? Which the this is indicative of those properties being on the actual app module class itself. Well, that's because I am doing some dependency injection. Earlier, I mentioned that the fun reason why I'm using ngDoBootstrap is having the Angular context, having dependency injection, having access to APIs of Angular, having APIs to my services, etc. And this is one way I decided to show it. With this, I am basically dependency injecting the environment object, the thing that comes from the environment folder that you might have per different server build of the application. And I'm also dependency injecting the window itself. Now, this might seem kind of insane to do, but realistically, it gives you a lot of good gains. This is kind of a side conversation on unit testing here, but Manually providing things like this, like the environment and the window, provides an easy way to mock out these kind of hard objects and global variables in a very easy way to do inside the test module when you're unit testing. So if I manually provide these objects with their injection tokens that I made up, down the road when I do a test module in my unit testing, I can just, again, manually provide these with my own mock values, and things will just kind of work in terms of the unit testing. Versus if I actually had to use the global window or the environment object from the file, those are kind of hard to mock out just willy-nilly. You'd have to like replace entire properties on the window and they reset them after the test. It's kind of a pain. So I usually go this route if I need to do anything like that in terms of using the window or whatever. It's much easier to mock out a dependency injection than it is to mock out like a global object. So that's the path I went with that. Some of the setup code to facilitate this is happening inside the environment.ts. Not going to go over this file too much, but again, just creating some tokens here. And then I also kind of created a mock environment object since StackBlitz doesn't really have that for some reason, but your typical Angular application would. So I have some type of environment type I can enum do some business logic with. Alrighty, so that's kind of some of the setup. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at some of the actual business logic now that we're making use of the window and the environment for in this decide root component function. So if I hop over to my util.ts function and squeeze some things to the side so I can get more of a good view, we can see that we have the side root component that's taken in a window and an environment argument. And at this point, I'm just doing my business logic to decide what root component I actually want to use for my application. I know it's a little bit silly, like the problem domain's not really something that would probably happen in a real application, but it could. But this is just kind of an example without giving away too much of what's happening on my client project itself. So in my case, I extracted the in iframe to like another pure function just to get that business logic away because it's a little bit weird in how it works. That functionality is down here, just checking to see if the window.self property is equal to the window.top property. If people don't know, that's basically just how you check to see if you're in an iframe. Some fun bits about how the window global object work is if the window object doesn't exist, maybe you're in a Node.js or a weird wrapper iframe thing, the window property might not exist. So if that's the case and an error is thrown, we go ahead and just return true just by default, saying you're probably in some type of weird iframe thing. And then past that, the extra bit of business logic here is just deciding what the environment is for this application. So if the environment of the application is in development mode or it's in an iframe, we're going to return back that app component. But if both of these, if one of these isn't true, so if it's not an iframe and it's not in development, then we're going to go ahead and return that in-frame component. Something I kind of skipped over is in the environment.ts, we're starting off in production mode. So we're only going to display this in-frame component if we're not in an iframe, which is that new window mode I showed earlier, saying, hey, this application should only be run in an iframe. But if I were to swap my environment here real quick to like development, for example, and I open up that new window, then everything just still says that main application. So a little bit quirky, just kind of how making use of StackBlitz, excuse me, functionality under the hood. But that's the crux of the business logic here. In this portion, I'm going to kind of sideline and talk about a few extra things that ngDoBootstrap is typically used for, just inside the StackBlitz context. So people are kind of aware of them. This isn't the only application for it. There's quite a few other things people use the ngDoBootstrap function for that I've seen across the internet. One of which is mostly just using it as a hook to do some extra setup code, whether it's authentication setup with services or localization setup. You can do this inside the ngDoBootstrap instead of the main.ts if you want. And that way you get hooks into all your services and your APIs and things like that if you need to. Otherwise, you can always do things like that in the main.ts. It's not too big of a deal. Another couple of things I wanted to mention real quick before we go more into the discussion period that's going to take place is what happens if you want to actually have multiple root components in your application using this process. Well, before it used to have a bootstrap property, right? With an array of components, something like that. So passing in this array means you can more than likely have multiple components. Very rarely happens. I usually don't see applications that have this, but if you need to, the way you would facilitate that using this ngDoBootstrap function is actually just calling this bootstrap function again with a different component. And that basically accomplishes the same result. It's kind of weird how this works, but that's more or less how that's done. And the final thing I'm going to mention here, before I start rambling too much, is that the ngDoBootstrap is, again, a hook into Angular's setup process for the app module when it's deciding what the root components is going to be. That means that Angular actually hasn't evaluated the index.html yet. Sorry about that. I think my headset shut off real quick. My apologies. But essentially, the index.html hasn't been evaluated yet during this process. So the fun part about that is I can now edit the index.html to my heart's content in this ngDoBootstrap to kind of influence what the root component is going to be. So in my client project, to make E2E testing easier with Cypress, I actually went through the process of removing the root element from the index.html and kind of manually adding the right elements tag to the index.html in this ngDoBootstrap process. Now you're probably wondering, why would I do that? Well, it's a bunch of, again, pure DOM code that I really didn't want to do, but it did make E2E testing with Cypress a little bit easier. I just booted up the application in the right environment type or whatever, and then I could very easily test to see if a certain element existed or not. And then at that point, you just change your selector to match. So instead of both being app-root, it could be app-root and a like iframe root or whatever. So just a couple caveats I wanted to mention, nothing too crazy, but just wanted to mention those so you kind of get the full scope of what ngDoBootstrap is for and can do. So with that, go ahead and kind of leave off with the actual demo and workshop. Or I guess not really workshop, but the demo. And at this point, just going to throw up this screen. If you want any of the code or the slides or whatever, that is on my GitHub. So at CJ Kipping on GitHub. And then the actual link to the StackBlitz repo is the dynamic application bootstrapping. And again, just general shout outs to Oasis, Angular, the Angular docs for Bootstrap, the Angular Bootcamp curriculum, and Git Bootstrap, since I kind of poked fun at them a little bit. So with that, we're probably going to transition into more open discussion questions. Doesn't necessarily have to be about Bootstrap. It could be talked about anything pretty much about Angular. It could be about the unit testing stuff I talked about or whatever. But going to transition more into that topic. If anyone takes off right now, just thanks for coming to the talk, and hope everyone has a good rest of the holiday season. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then we'll get into the discussion portion.
Well,
if I can find
I've got a couple questions queued up that I can ask you while other people are contemplating theirs.
Right.
So the ngDoBootstrap, yeah, that's like really cool. How on earth did you even know to look for that?
So it's interesting because we were actually using it on our project before. I actually needed to do this bit, so I knew it was existent because I knew this hook existed just from that code, and we were using it to bootstrap, basically set up a keycloak service. I know I mentioned earlier that you could do some authentication or like localization setup in that ngDoBootstrap hook, and just bootstrap the root component still, just like normal.
So
that's what we're
just
doing.
because of for just like kind of
Yeah,
path dependent
happenstance.
reasons,
Yeah.
you would happen to
Yeah.
say, because like I've had maybe a very slightly similar problem, which I solved by using a different root module.
Right. Yeah, that's possible.
And it really wasn't too bad. I just like had the main one, had the secondary one, like import the main one. I didn't have to duplicate that much code.
Right.
But clearly it's not nearly as fit for purpose. I mean, the ngBootstrap or doBootstrap just seems exactly made for this, right?
Yeah,
It's like
and like it has Angular context, and you can access your APIs. Yeah, it's a very Angular specific solution to this problem. The only other one I could think of that might rival this is doing like an app initializer, pretty much inside a provider. But that gets a little bit more complicated with
And
factories.
I don't think you could
Stuff,
swap out
so.
your root component with that.
Yeah, exactly. You can't. So if you need to swap out your root
Yeah,
component, then
you'd
yeah,
have to like do some ifs and such
yeah, you'd have to do.
inside your root
That's another thing
component.
I want to mention. Like I wanted to try and get the code away from the everyday developers, so I didn't want to do just like a random ngIf and the app component and then add an extra layer. So pulling this out to the app module made it pretty simple to kind of abstract away and again just duplicate with a schematic. So at least in our NX repo. So
Interesting. Okay. The other thing that I'll throw my other question or comment out. Looks like we have another person almost ready to ask. Is I noticed on one of your screens that you had an interface property named type.
yeah,
And that reminded me, it is so weird that type is both like a semi-reserved word and a totally legit name for a
yeah,
variable
legit
or
property
field.
name. Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah,
kind of
I mean,
weird how that
every
works.
time I see that, I'm like, but type is a reserved word, but not really,
Yep,
because
it kind of
TypeScript is
depends on the
so
context.
compatible.
Yeah. It's also kind
Yeah,
of weird if you saw my pure function, like I was passing it a window, but I was still using the window keyword. So it's just like overarching concerns
yeah.
of the global window versus a actual function window. It gets a little bit weird sometimes, but yeah,
Okay, we
it's
got at
pretty cool.
least two people ready, so I'm going to step aside, let other people
Yep.
ask real questions.
Yeah, I had a question. One thing we've done in the past is we've had an app component that almost has nothing in it. It's
Right.
like a router outlet, and then we've used lazy loaded routes to like load this part of the app or that part of the app, depending on like where they're navigating. I was
Yep.
wondering, like, have you used this for layout, which is what we were doing that for, or was there some other motivation as well?
Yeah, so all of our systems actually, again, because we're using an NX system, so we actually do that whole like app module is pretty empty and app component are pretty empty, and then they lazy load the actual feature module or whatever. The reason we didn't really go that path is because I didn't really want to mess too much with what the actual developers were doing on their applications and their feature code. I wanted to kind of extract it away. It wasn't too much of a layout concern. There's a few things we had to do with layout, adding certain classes, situating the index.html a certain way with the components. But it was actually pretty close to the way the iframe thing worked. It was just more for like Electron apps versus a different type of thing we wanted to position things a certain way. You could still accomplish that with routing and the separate components, but yeah, everything just kind of came upon that crux of wanting still like the same setup we had, the default setup, everything worked, abstracting it out to a separate thing so people could do whatever they wanted inside their application, didn't have to have any weird routing setups or app component setups. So, but yeah,
Okay.
if you just had your project and that works, then perfect. There's always a dozen solutions to everything. So
Yeah. Did you
yeah.
happen to still use lazy routing also in addition for other
Yeah,
things?
yeah. So like we still use lazy loading and lazy routing for pretty much everything.
Okay. So not
And we still
replacing
have,
coding.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not replacing, just in addition to. Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for the question.
Hey, what's up, guys? I got here a little late. Could you in the background just share what you did while you're taking questions, maybe, just for a little bit? Maybe I can see what you
So yeah,
did.
Maybe
just in
just like get
general
him
without having to
the
talk.
link to the code or something.
Yeah, I can
Um,
definitely give the link to.
That'll
Da-
work too. Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah, no worries.
Daniel, we try to avoid leaving the screen share up because then when people go back to watch a recording, instead of a conversation, they see one little tiny talking head in the corner and a giant static screen with nothing changing. So that's
Nice.
why we do that way.
Okay, yep. Pop that into the chat, and yeah, that should be the GitHub link. That links to the stack blitz and to the slides and the README, so that should be available as well. Yeah, so the beginning of the talk was more just talking about bootstrapping in general, and then went into the depths of how ngDoBootstrap worked. So definitely a good review if you don't know that stuff off the top of your head. Cool. Any other questions or just general discussion stuff? I know some of the stuff I did with unit testing and manual providers and stuff like that, not always used, but I know quite a few people are getting used to that dynamic of doing unit tests. So didn't know if
So
there's any
Zachary,
questions or discussion with that.
I
Yeah,
know you said at the beginning that that some of this came out of like an actual problem you had on an actual customer thing. So I know like you can't tell us about the actual customer's specifics,
right.
but it seems like from the scenario you described and just some little bits and pieces you said, this is maybe some kind of like a micro front end kind of thing.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
not to get
like without divulging anything, that'll get
without
you in
getting
trouble. Can
too
you tell us about
into
like how you're doing that? How well it's working out? Like how
yeah.
sprawling is it? Like is this good? Should we all be doing this?
So the micro and front end strategy we kind of deployed with was having like a wrapper shell of an application that we kind of deployed a whole bunch of different applications for various different machines and other things. And those will appear in iframes based on the routes or the purpose of some API data. So overall, it's going pretty well. We're still in like beginning phases of it. New projects are being made, things like that, that are being put in the iframes. But so far, it's going pretty well. The UI shell is managed by us, and then all the micro front ends are managed by the actual developer teams that have awareness of the data and doing all that good stuff. So overall, it's going pretty well. The only weird things we've seen so far is managing routing. So you might say like inside of an iframe, you might have its own Angular routing. We kind of want that to propagate up to the global route of the browser. So to have some refreshes or bookmarks or something, they would land on the correct route in the iframe. A little bit of complication there, but again, nothing too bad, and we're able to solve it. Overall, it's going pretty good though. I don't recommend micro front ends for everything, and I don't recommend iframes for everything because they're complicated and weird. But yeah, it's going well so far with us with that strategy. So
Like, are you like kind of living the kind of advertised benefit of like different teams building different routes or different parts of an application and pretty much high isolation from each other, or
yeah,
like what's
exactly.
the
Yep. So even without the iframe, we also just have general routes of the application being completely made by other people, at least with feature modules and stuff like that. So we're making full use of how NX really works, and that's been like a very, very useful tool, not only with schematics and things like that, but also just having everything so separated and finely tuned, essentially,
and
to
is it
micro front ends.
are you micro front ending like all Angular, or are you getting some other languages in for some of the routes, or
Right
like what?
now, it's only Angular, but it could essentially be anything, as long as we could communicate through the iframe to it with like dispatch messages. They could be React, they could be Svelte, whatever. Anything that could be loaded inside of an iframe, we could micro front end pretty much with our Angular wrapper. So
Cool.
yeah, it's pretty neat.
I see other people with camera on, so I'm gonna yield.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the testing because it's not really a question. It's more of a comment, which is the
Yeah.
worst thing you should do. But
No worries.
yeah, I have run into what you talked about there with the difficulty of mocking out something on window itself. And
Yep.
it never occurred to me to inject a window the way that you're doing there. So
Yep.
even if I never have the opportunity to do ng on Bootstrap, I think I'm going to take that from this talk.
Yeah, it's definitely a good takeaway. I went through the very tedious process of doing like after tests, cleanup and stuff like that on window properties, just like resetting the whole object or whatever. It's a pain. So just being able to actually mock that out through dependency injection makes everything 1,000 times easier. It's not only for me, but also for just the general run-of-the-mill developers that are needing to mock out stuff. It just makes everything more straightforward. So, good comment. Anyone else have anything they want to talk about or discuss? Doesn't specifically have to be with my talk. We go into like more of a free discussion period. If anyone wants to talk anything about Angular or their projects or anything cool they're working on too.
Yeah, I mean, especially if anybody has more broad Angular stuff, we'll go ahead and keep it in what we publish as part of this. I'll throw it out there. So you mentioned, I think, a couple of times that you're on a big project using NX.
Yep.
Have you been keeping up to date on the latest and greatest?
We are still on NX10. We were waiting for NX11 to launch before we went to Angular 11, although
Which it has.
realistically, yeah, which it has, but that happened, I think this week or late last week, whenever it happened. Unfortunately, it hit us at a wrong time period. With this being end of the season holidays, I'm off next week. So, I think we're doing that sometime in January, after a few demos launch and everything kind of settles down again. But I'm looking forward to actually upgrading all that stuff again and getting on ESLint, which is a big thing we haven't done yet. We're still on TSLint. So
on my project, we are also on NX10, and the holiday actually works out well for us because our client is shut down next week, and
nice.
Oasis is not. At least not the
Right,
whole week.
the half week. Yeah.
So we're planning that one of our, we're calling tech debt stories that we're working on when we don't need client interaction is the NX 11 upgrade.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, and to be only a few weeks behind the upstream releases is just really fantastic as enterprise projects go. I mean, I talk with current and prospective customers that are stuck on 2-year-old dependencies or
Right, like
worse.
Angular 6 or 7, you're like, how? But it
Yeah, well, I
happens.
mean, first you're kind of like aghast, but then there's
Right.
like these are usually staffed by quite smart people, and
Yep.
there's usually some like pretty significant obstacle to them keeping up to date. You just kind of feel bad for people that are.
Yeah.
it's
I'm
like,
actually very
there's like
honored to be on
legit
this
things
project
holding
just
them
'cause
back.
the current project I'm on, I'm actually kind of honored I'm on it because they're very forward thinking and stuff like that. They're always like new dependencies, want to be on them as much as possible just to get the newest and greatest. My previous project, don't want to speak too much about them, but very, very large company, a lot of overhead in validating and verifying new packages and releases. So it was kind of a bog, there'd be 2 or 3 months, which isn't that bad realistically, but there'd be like a giant quarterly gap pretty much of needing to verify certain packages, updating things, and stuff like that. So it can be a bit of a slog sometimes, but hopefully things work out.
Yeah, I mean, even somebody who keeps like a quarter behind is actually doing
Yeah,
quite
it's not
well
too bad.
compared
Yeah.
to many organizations. Oh, here's somebody in our chat said to show
Yeah,
them
yarn
result
audit.
of a yarn audit, or I'd say NPM's audit also works well for this. Yeah, definitely. When you see like known security issues on your current version that are fixed on a new version, can really turn around the mental math on how eagerly to update. Right. So, well, the hesitancy to upgrade because there might be a problem with a new thing versus the known existence of a problem, particularly a security problem with an old thing, can that's a good way to sort of nudge if there's someone resisting keeping reasonably up to date. You can sort
And
of get
also
people
just
unstuck.
performance improvements too, because I mean, if people are on an older version of Angular, things are kind of bogged down a little. And like, there's been marginal improvements with every single latest version of Angular. So I think it's going in a relatively good direction with like performance and size of the bundles and things like that. So it's always a good, at least a minor good reason to upgrade always is faster, faster, faster usually. So,
Yeah, I think for versions 9 and 10, there were stories of
yeah.
companies getting pretty significant wins
Yep.
without, with very little change to application code, little to no change, and then getting like a, still pretty big bundle, but like a smaller, pretty big bundle.
Right.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, Zachary, that you're micro front ending.
Yep.
So that would mean that you're not bundling all the features of the entire application suite into one giant, 7 megabytes of JavaScript.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So you might not be as affected by the kind of bundle size thing if you're already
Right.
only
Yeah,
carrying
but
the bundle.
we are
for
definitely affected by the build times because in our pipeline we went the full NX route of doing like very parallelized builds and testing and unit testing,
Yep.
linting, all that good stuff, right? So definitely saw nice improvements in build times just for having like 10, 20 odd applications all being built at the same time. Only the ones that need to be built get built if it's affected, all that good stuff. So NX plus Angular improvements have always been pushing forward with some good improvements. So
Now, I've worked on projects on the CI where the kind of default CI hardware or instance is kind of weak.
yeah.
And I've had to throttle down NX's parallelism to reduce the number of parallel jobs to avoid crashing on
Yeah,
memory.
I think we currently max out. I know for a fact we do 3 larger bins, and then that kind of decreases the size of each individual NX build because you kind of split up the whole thing into 3 different bins, get a slice of chunk, and then those are parallelized as well. So cleans things up a little bit. It's a little more complicated to do the binning. I know we're on like Azure, so Azure's binning of jobs is a little
Sure.
bit weird in how they do the parallelization there. But it is a fun kind of problem to solve as well. So
we've got somebody else unmuted, ready to go here.
Yeah, I actually had a question on the binning. By that you mean like running on multiple machines at the same time to parallelize
Yeah, so essentially what we
Okay.
did was we took the output of the affected, like we did basically a print affected,
Mhm.
and got that list of all the different projects or whatever that need to be either linted, built, tested, whatever. And we took those and split it into 3 different bins, and then had those go on their own machines that are then doing the NX parallelization as well. So it made things a little
Gotcha.
bit faster, just in terms of NX not hogging all the resources of the machine as well. So I think the only thing
Yeah, I
so far we
actually,
haven't done is Cypress parallelization. But again, that uses their dashboard. It's a little bit of a third-party thing, so haven't gotten that full way yet.
just got our client to upgrade to 4 CI machines from 1,
Nice, yeah.
which is that in itself has been
That's a huge
amazing.
improvement,
Just
yeah.
being able to run multiple CI things at once for pull requests. But my next goal is to be able to split a single CI job between multiple machines if they're available.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, there's a helicopter
Oh, you're fine.
outside, so I'll stop.
Don't duck down, it'll be fine. But yeah, so Azure, I don't know which pipeline system you're using, but I know Azure, like we split everything as much into distinct stages and jobs as much as possible. And I think we're kind of lucky we have like 8 or 9 or whatever CI machines that keep upping and upping it because we have a lot of developers doing a lot of PRs and pipelines. So we need a lot of resources. But every single job can be just done in isolation, whether it's linting, testing, building, generating translations, all the stuff that needs to be done. And once that's done, publishes artifacts. Those get pulled down into a different CI machine if need be, and then the entire thing goes. Like you could have 2 different CI pipelines going at the same time, alternating between jobs, just depending on open resources, and things just work. So it's kind of fun to see that work out
So
if you
Yeah,
can
so
get that far.
so it really
are
stands
you
out to
guys
me here. Oh,
using,
sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
sorry, are you
Uh-huh.
guys using Azure Pipeline, you said?
Yeah, we're using Azure Pipeline. It's not, I don't want to talk badly about it. It is really, really good. It's very powerful. There are some weird kinks or quirks with it, sorry. Weird quirks with it that you kind of have to figure out. But more or less, yeah, we're just parallelizing all the jobs. I don't think that's a default on Azure because you have to have the parallelization on in all the CI machines to support it with the pools. But yeah, it's been pretty cool and pretty fun to work on in terms of just the whole NX monorepo system as well. So.
Yeah, I always find myself kind of like almost fighting myself because I like the idea of using Azure, Azure to do CI is great because we use it for our actual machines and all
Right.
our VMs are hosted through Azure. So that in one
Nice, yeah.
sense feels great. But then also, I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket where then
That's
we're
fair.
stuck to Azure.
Yeah, that's
Because
fair.
if we use Azure pipelines, then it's like we couldn't switch to GCP or AWS if that came about. So I
Yeah,
don't know,
I
that's
know
something I keep in mind too.
we use a lot of like we're a mix of Azure and a lot of Docker and Kubernetes. So we're not entirely all in one basket. I mean, most of our stuff is Microsoft and Azure just because big, very large company, Microsoft's or Google are enticing. But yeah, it's not too bad unless they have an outage, but that doesn't happen too often. So.
So something that really stands out from both from what you're describing here and from what I've seen in quite a few of our internal and customer systems is like there's a temptation to attack these sort of things using your build pipelines features. So you find things like, let's write some script or some JavaScript to run this command to see what's affected, and then go pipe that back in to tell our pipeline system how to like run things in parallel. And this is just crying out for a build system that understands how to do this. So I'm curious if your project has got to the point where it's considering something like Bazel, or if it's just not big enough to consider that yet. Because like, I mean, we're like essentially like coding this stuff at the pipeline level, you're kind of bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah. um, I think we've gotten to a point where it's good with NX. If anything gets too much more complicated, it might get weird. I know sometimes with our storybook stuff, because we have like storybook along with all the NX and Angular and all that stuff. So sometimes the affected doesn't work perfectly with how storybook does its little MDX files and stuff. So I think the next level will probably be using something like Bazel to just kind of have all the inputs, no matter what they are, and then eventually just getting some uniform output in terms of what needs to be run. So,
Well, so with a build tool, rather than having it tell you what needs to be run, like the fundamental metaphor would change, and that you would
True,
just tell
right.
it, do the
Here are my
thing,
inputs. Yeah.
and then it would go run those things.
Yeah.
And things like like you could configure it to use remote executors. And so you could, instead of having like a, you know, here is our kind of configured way of using these pipelines across these machines, like here's a scalable pool of build execution machines. And yeah, we just allocate more to run more as needed if there's a backlog of builds to be done. So
Right.
it's a very different way. But on the other hand, you're talking about probably a lot further away from what every developer already understands.
Yeah, it wasn't
That's the
too
biggest
bad. Yeah.
resistance. Yeah.
Well, it was me writing a little bit of custom node code to kind of orchestrate
Right.
some of the stuff between NX's print affected and actually making the bins and running stuff and combining all the results and globs and stuff like that. Wasn't too
Yeah.
bad, but if it gets too much more, it would be nice to have something that's more uniform, one actual thing, and like Bazel,
If you
to
need
actually
more
orchestrate it.
parallelism, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
if you need to say, no, I need to make this maximally parallel based on the dependency graph.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, our dependency graph gets a little bit weird for NX sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, NX, they're making great strides, but they still have a
Yeah.
relatively limited understanding of the real dependency graph.
Yeah, because they only really focus on your actual, like in our case, our Angular code. But we also have like Storybook on top of that. We have translations on top of that. So some of it we're doing still a little bit manually, doing what we can with it based on like Git changes and things like that. But again, we're doing a decent amount of manual stuff. NX takes quite a
Yeah.
bit of it away, but yeah, there's still quite a bit of it left.
Yeah, interesting.
I feel like that's a big difficulty though, especially when you're working on these projects that maybe you have a few developers that aren't as experienced with Angular. So they're still getting onboarded with Angular, but choosing the correct like CI or build process that is still going to be maintainable by them,
Yep.
and they're going to be able to get a grasp on it, even if it's not a great one.
Mhm.
Versus like something like Bazel, which I feel like is more of a DevOpsy. You have like a dedicated person, I feel like. So I feel like that's part of the struggle I have is I'd love to use better tooling, but there's that fine line of what is too much just for the team to grasp. So it's not just one person managing it.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. I know in my case with my client project, we were like one of the newer front end teams or whatever we are, larger than the team, but still kind of a team. But we were kind of going into unknown ground with UI development with Node.js and Angular and all this stuff. They were mostly like a C# .NET house. So a lot of their like templates and stuff like that in Azure were kind of based on .NET. And I had to go in and say, all right, I don't really know a ton of like I know DevOps, but I don't know Azure that well, at least going into the project. And then I had to learn all that stuff and bring in like my Node.js experience and my Angular experience and some NX stuff to try and mash something together that was both actually performance and also just reusable in terms of templates. You know, if anyone needs to add more jobs or the project to a thing, it's a few clicks and they're good. But it was an interesting process to learn for a fact.
By the way, tangential to that, I just want to just huge kudos for somebody who works at Microsoft to take the word DevOps and change it from an idea out in the community to the name of a product that someone can do a PO for.
Yeah, true.
Brilliant. Just brilliant. Are you DevOpsing? Yes. Here's my bill where I bought some DevOps. That's just brilliant.
Yeah, it's definitely a fun strategy.
Well, it seems like it's just three of us here still chatting. We're coming up on our hour we promised people. I guess we just see if there's anyone else in our Zoom room who
I know we
wants to
started
talk
talking a
about
lot about DevOps. We can
any
always
other-
talk about pretty much anything Angular.
I mean, this is the advanced Angular lunch, so if it's somewhat Angular related, we can
Sure.
slide it in and call it legit. So
I
And-
enjoyed
Actually
getting
had
about DevOps. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
had a question about how you guys manage or how you feel about managing such spreaded teams where you're not so integrated, like you were saying, with being on the micro front end, how do you find you're either more or less successful compared to maybe a more traditional where you have a more integrated team working on the whole platform? How do you
Yeah.
find that
So
experience?
for us, it's actually been kind of fun because my actual team, which is like only a handful, is from ODSI. We are more like on the architectural high level stuff. So we're focusing more on like the ngDoBootstrap stuff, like working on schematics with NX, setting up the broad shell application that's hosting all these micro front ends. And then that leaves all the general developers, all the other actual teams to focus on their product, their actual data and their business logic, which leaves them to actually like focus in on that. You know, we still do PR reviews on their stuff to make sure they're doing good quality code and all that, but they get to really focus and hone in on their specifics, their requirements, their stories, whatever. And then we're left to do all the higher level complicated stuff that, in my opinion, is more fun. But yeah, so it kind of splits it off in that nice segment, I guess. And then it's been working out pretty well. Traditional apps, like I have to have a lot of domain knowledge and stuff like that. This project would have, there's so much domain knowledge, it would take me years to learn, and I've gotten up and going on it within 6 months-ish. So it's been
Yeah, that's
a
a
pretty fun ride.
common problem on our ends too, is there's so much domain knowledge where like they'll start talking about it and we're all just like, what?
Right, it's like,
We just have
I
no
don't know what to talk
idea.
about. Yeah, yeah, that happened a
But yeah,
lot.
no, that sounds like it's like a really good solution to have that overarching team to do that core functionality, and then you
Yep.
have those subgroups. That actually makes a lot of sense. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah,
Think of
and
that when I was, going
our
through it.
core team's also like setting standards for practices and things like that, leaving example apps, example code, just kind of lying around. And then schematics too. Schematics are complicated. They're kind of weird to get into with NX, but being able to just write one command and get a whole new feature application with like the actual app, the E2E, some featured libs and some API code and NGRX already preset up, all this stuff with good example code and testing is like, it's amazing. Makes everything a lot easier, along with good documentation, just means the world. So
Yeah, that's actually a good point of using schematics, because I find, especially with divided teams, it's really hard to get all the teams to use all the resources that you have
yep.
available, like end-to-end testing or unit testing. A lot of people that don't do that now are really hard to get on board. So if you, like
Yeah,
you
you have
said,
to
write a
start somewhere.
schematic, yeah, no, that's a really good idea.
Yep. And that way, since they do the schematic, they get a new E2E app, they get the unit testing built in, things fail in the pipeline automatically. So they kind of have to write that stuff during their PRs. So it's kind of a nice process.
Well, we should probably wrap up since we're at our hours, unless anybody else wants to pop up with more Angularisms.
John,
Oh,
wanna say
somebody's
something?
here.
Oh.
I see a
I
John.
was just gonna pop on. I figured I'd jump on for a minute because I'm on the same project, and I
Yep.
wanted to just go a little deeper into the things that schematics can do for us. I know it's not
Definitely.
really the topic of this talk, but as Zachary was saying, we put it out there so it generates all these, not just example code, but like sample tests to go along with that code. And so we can watch and see as people delete those test files to say, no, you had to put that in there. We put that in for a reason. And so that's something we actually dealt with recently. Because that can be kind of hard to catch the first time if you're going over a huge commit of all these new files that just got added, to make sure that they got ample test coverage. If you start them with ample test coverage, you can kind of see which direction they go.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier. I'm glad we have those, and you did the grunt work of getting a lot of those set up. So
Are you doing a coverage tool in your CI, John?
We are, but by default, so what we found with unit testing is that it scans all your test files and then compares them to the files they're testing and looks to see how much is covered. But if you're just missing a file altogether, it doesn't pick that up in the test coverage.
yeah, it's
So
kind
if
of a
you
weird quirk
right
with Jest
test
or whatever.
coverage setup, it actually instruments your code, and then it runs all the tests, and it keeps track of which lines of your code got exercised by your tests.
Yeah,
That's what I
that's what I'm used
thought.
to with like
I
Karma and
maybe
Jasmine. I don't know if Jest has a weird setup for it or what, but
maybe
I
we didn't
know,
set a
yeah,
flag right.
I don't know.
Yeah, because that's the ideal case. That way, like no matter how you
Yeah, that
manage
would be
to
ideal.
miss testing, it's going to find it because it just says, well, this code exists and it didn't get executed. Therefore, it must not be covered.
Yeah,
Now
that'd be
you
the
can
best
still
case.
have tests that do trivial, like execute code, but don't actually test that it worked. So it's not, and that's not a foolproof way to get like real
Right.
coverage, but it's a
But
pretty
that's where the
good.
PR comes in. You can see that, hey, yeah, this doesn't actually do anything.
Hmm.
Redo this.
Yeah, we'll have to take a note maybe over the next few weeks when
Yeah.
things have slowed
During
down.
the
We can
holiday
take a
season.
look at that.
It sounds like we might have an upcoming advanced lunch on test coverage, maybe.
Yeah.
I've been wanting to talk about schematics.
That too.
I think
be a
I'm
good
at a point now where I can break it down into something that can be talked about.
And now you've volunteered in public.
It's on recorded. Alrighty.
Are we all done for today's lunch? I guess everybody's
Seems that way.
probably hungry to
Like
go eat an
most
actual
people
lunch.
skedaddled. Yeah.
I kind of miss eating actual lunch at lunch, but soon we'll be
Yeah.
back.
I had my
Soon,
lunch at like
hopefully.
11:30.
Ish.
So
Yeah, so did I.
Same here.
it works out.
Okay, well, I guess
All right.
bye everybody.
See ya.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.